Hello, this is my first presentation for my channel, Schola Ecclesia. Thanks for listening. I have a PhD in classical philology, which is the study of ancient Greece and Rome, primarily their literature. But to know the literature, you must also know something about the culture. The Roman army is my specialty, but the channel will be covering a wide range of topics, including literature, but also history and philosophy, both ancient and modern. My website explains more about what I aim to do. So on to the present topic of the Roman army, its concepts of courage and discipline, its rewards, and its elements of meritocracy. Every army reflects the society that produces it. An ancient Roman society was an odd, paradoxical blend of stubborn traditionalism and practical adaptation. The Roman army would maintain, in some cases, traditions that were centuries old, but at the same time, when they needed to, they would famously adopt tactics and weapons from their enemies. In Roman society, there were religious rituals that were, again, sometimes centuries old, that the Romans would perform with such unerring precision that by the imperial era the words in archaic Latin were no longer intelligible. The Roman army is another one of these social fossils. It was consciously traditionalist. You could look at the legions that defeated Hannibal and also look at those that served under Emperor Marcus Aurelius, depicted in the film Gladiator, patrolling the northern frontier, and they would have looked remarkably similar. It was an important symbol of tradition to the Romans themselves, and today it's still an iconic image of tough discipline. The Roman army's system of commendations, hierarchy of command, code of discipline were among the most consistent and regular by the standards of the ancient world. Now, it was not a professional army in the sense that it had a uniformly consistent set of regulations. It did not, but it was remarkably close as possible, as achieved by the ancient world, to a modern professional army. So, in part, this is a case study of the Roman army to examine not just what motivated Roman soldiers, but what motivates people in general. What are the merits, essentially? What are the merits of a meritocracy? And so this is something that I discussed in my dissertation, which you can look at on the website for free. What exactly constitutes the values of courage and discipline, and do they conflict? The Roman army has had a reputation for literally centuries, if not millennia, for ferocious discipline. It's somewhat mythologized, but the question remains, does severity produce courage? The Romans deliberately cultivated a warrior ethos to inspire young men to voluntary acts of courage, which are different from those acts of courage that are performed under duress or coercion. So what is the difference? That's what I'd like to explore here. So these are deep questions, and we can easily get distracted on tangents, but like I noted earlier in this presentation and future ones, I don't want to just reproduce something you can read in an encyclopedia. Let's try to think critically about what we're talking about. It's customary in academic publications to outline what models and methodologies have influenced your thinking, how you're approaching the topic. So we can't go back to ancient Rome and look at these military awards as an ancient Roman would, but we can appreciate that they are symbols. And symbols can mean almost anything, not everything, but they can mean things to different people. So it is worthwhile to look at them as symbols and attempt, with the literary and archaeological evidence, to attempt to reconstruct ancient Roman society, to attempt to look at them in context. When I'm looking at the values of courage, the virtue of courage, I'm using the golden mean or the Aristotelian mean, which I'll explain in detail later. Aristotle is one of my favorite philosophers, and the golden mean could be a presentation by itself, but I'll get into this later. The focus is on the crown, the civic crown. It's the most famous and recognizable military award, and once I look at that, we can look more deeply at the underlining qualities, virtues that this represented to the Romans. And then I'll look at specific events and examples and notable individuals from Roman military history. A meritocracy is a hierarchy of competence. It's a system in which individuals are promoted and rewarded based upon their ability. As we shall see, the Roman army could not be a perfect meritocracy. Their society was, after all, an aristocratic oligarchy. The senior officers were exclusively aristocrats. But the aristocratic warrior class cultivated a warlike ethos. They were bred for war. They were bred and trained for war and leadership. And sometimes they failed quite disastrously, but unlike the Carthaginians, the Romans did not crucify unsuccessful commanders, even if they were defeated badly, but they were ostracized, particularly if they did not conduct themselves well, if they did not fight courageously. And the Romans rewarded every soldier, regardless of their social status, if they fought courageously. But the Carthaginians, this is a topic for another presentation, but Carthaginian armies were of very uneven quality. And it does discourage initiative, and maybe that was the objective, but it does discourage initiative and, aggressiveness and grit when, if you make a mistake, you could possibly be crucified. And so Hannibal was definitely one of the great, commanders of the ancient world, but the average Carthaginian commander was subpar, I think, in contrast to the average Roman commander. One of the most famous military awards was the crown, specifically the civic crown of oak leaves, which was later worn by the Roman emperors. So the significance of the symbol eventually transcends the Roman army. To appreciate the gravity of such symbols in an ancient Roman context, let's look at the antecedents of this symbol. To briefly note the contributions of anthropologist Dr. Clifford Geertz, who really influenced my thinking, he argued that in order to understand human behavior, we must also grasp the conceptual world in which the behavior takes place, which involves looking at symbols that cultures produce to convey meaning, ideas, etc. And he refers to culture as a web of significance. So, for example, before we look at the Roman army and the crowns, the swastika, as used by Buddhist monks, represents good fortune, especially when it's facing left, and you walk around temples clockwise and it's good luck. So it would mean something different to a Buddhist monk, especially one living 1,000 years ago, than would someone today. In an ancient context, proskynesis, the bowing before a king, as the Persians did, the Greeks didn't do that before kings or even gods. It was taboo. And like in martial arts schools, for example, like Taekwondo, I know you bow before you enter the mat as a sign of respect towards the instructor. This is a symbol. This is an act that conveys a meaning. There's a couple of fellows in my dojo who do not bow because it's taboo in their religion. It's a symbol that means something different to them. They don't mean or intend disrespect. They nod and give respect in other ways, but they don't bow because that is a symbol from their culture that means something else, as an example. And also, it's worth noting the swastika it's a symbol that's used widely, even by the ancient Italic peoples of central Italy, the ancient ancestors of the ancient Romans. We have archaeological evidence they used the symbol. So it is a symbol. The crown is a symbol, and that's what we're looking at. Pliny the Elder, Roman antiquarian and scholar who died at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, he wrote The Natural History, one of the longest works to survive from classical literature, and it's the model for our encyclopedias today. He said that crowns were worn commonly when sacrificing to the gods, so there's these ancient religious connotations as well to this symbol. He also notes that Homer said that it wasn't proper for humans originally to wear them at all, so it may relate to this Greek concept, an important theme known as hubris, or overweening pride, which was usually punished by the gods. And in a sense, it may relate to the Roman custom of having a slave accompany a successful Roman commander during his victory parade known as the Triumphus, the slave would say, "Memento mori," remember to die. So the Olympics, held every 4 years, like today, the rewards for victory was the crown. So there is this connection with this symbol, this crown, between athletics and war, and athletics was a way to train young men for war. In the context of an ancient city-state, to enjoy the privileges of citizenship, you would have also the obligation to perform military service, and likely you would. So Pliny notes that Romans crowned successful commanders who returned from war. The main point is that the symbol denotes victory. There's connections with religion and athletics, and as we'll see, the Romans developed a number of varieties of crowns consistently to award clearly defined acts of valor. Here's an anecdote from Herodotus. Greek, probably the world's first historian, a certain Tigranes from the Persian camp during the Persian invasion of Greece said, "Good heavens, Mardonius, what kind of men are these that you pitted us against? It's not for money they contend, but for glory of achievement." Clearly in admiration and respect for the Greek ethos and their valor. An unlikely source for Roman military awards was Aulus, a Roman poet who wrote in the imperial era around the time of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, the Stoic philosopher emperor depicted in Gladiator. He provides a list here of the varieties of Roman crowns. There were other awards, but this presentation here is a sort of a case study, so let's focus on these. The civic crown was awarded for saving the life of a citizen in battle. Doesn't matter what his language, ethnicity, or class was. But it usually involved the slaying of an enemy in the process. The triumphal crown made of gold, which I just talked about. The triumph was a victory parade with the highest prestige. It was more important than the ovation down there at the bottom, the ovational crown. The difference between the siege crown, the wall crown and the camp crown was it was the first man over the enemy's parapet or circuit wall around their city during a conventional siege. The camp is a military camp, a marching camp. So there's the naval crown as well, then the siege crown, which was rare. Polybius, the Greek historian who observed the Roman army in action during the early Republic, records there were a number of items that could be awarded to Roman soldiers, such as cups, spears, cavalry accoutrements, etc. Here's a list of other exceptional examples of commendation. Spolia opima, probably the most prestigious award that could be acquired by a Roman soldier. There's only 3 recipients in nearly 1,300 years of Roman military history. One was Claudius Marcellus, historically thoroughly documented, no controversy, not a legendary figure, who slew a Celtic chieftain during the conquest of the Po Valley in northern Italy. He took spoils. The same Marcellus later challenged Hannibal to single combat, but Hannibal declined. There was a contingent of Praenestine troops who garrisoned Casilinum after Cannae. And if I can pause for a moment, the Second Punic War, one of the biggest wars in ancient history, has some of the most remarkable episodes and incidents in Roman military history, particularly given how desperate Rome was in those days and given the quality of the opposition in Hannibal. Anyways, these soldiers were offered citizenship, voted double paid exemption. The Praenestines chose to maintain their civic status in their own town, but the Romans were really impressed by their service. They didn't make it to Cannae, but they distinguished themselves during the siege of Casilinum. So you could Rome was really desperate. I mean, this is another example of how desperate Rome was after Cannae. They recruited slaves. Presumably, many of these may have been Celts recently captured in the Po Valley, and they composed an army that campaigned fairly successfully in southern Italy, and they were given their freedom after the Battle of Lucaria. Names, titles are often, this has little to do with the lower ranks or even junior officers, but successful commanders might take an epithet for the territory or region that they conquered. again, probably the most famous Roman military award was the civic crown, or civica corona, which I discussed in my dissertation in detail because it raises some interesting ethical, philosophical questions. And to reiterate it was awarded for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle, presumably slaying an enemy as well in the process. So I asked if the war is unethical, that is, one community bears, in a sense, a collective responsibility for waging an unjust or illegal war, is it still possible for the individuals who are participating in the war to evince virtue, to have virtue, to evince virtue, namely courage? The civic crown is an example in the positive, since an individual can engage in a voluntary act for the sake of another, that is, self-sacrifice. So, a soldier may be coerced into participating in an unjust war. In fact, civilians can be coerced into doing something. In fact, specifically, they can be coerced into paying their taxes for an unjust war, alongside other things. But this doesn't preclude voluntary acts of courage. And you can't, like in a court of law, you can't blame someone for doing something under duress anyways. But for individuals, you can evince virtue voluntarily, voluntary acts of virtue. So the three authors I've already mentioned, Aeschylus the poet, Polybius, Pliny the Elder, they go into detail about this specific award. They agree on the most important details. It's a crown that consists of oak leaves and is awarded for saving the life of a fellow citizen. Polybius emphasizes that the act is voluntary. They're not acting under the compulsion of their officers. And he also adds that the man who is saved reverences. There's a sense of paternal reverence for his Savior and calls him his father for the rest of his life. And if you notice in Roman culture, the term pater is a word for a lot of very important concepts in Roman civilization. The senators, the patres, the country, the nation of Rome, patria, the fatherland, and so on. To quote Pliny the Elder, to preserve an ally merely, even though it should be the life of a king that is so saved, confers no right to this high reward, nor is the honor at all increased, even if it is the Roman general that has been thus preserved, it being the intention of the framers of the law that it should be the status of the citizen that is everything. So this is an interesting example of meritocracy in the Roman army, where regardless of your class, and Rome had a strictly hierarchical social structure, nevertheless, doesn't matter which class you are, and it doesn't matter who the person is that is saved, you're entitled to the same award. And so it encourages people to do this. It encourages people to evince virtue and go beyond what is required, by their commander, since again this is voluntary, not under orders. So he also says, when a man has received this wreath, it is his, or crown, whatever, it is his privilege to wear it for the rest of his life. When he makes his appearance at the celebration of the games, it is customary for the Senate even to rise from their seats, and he has the right of taking his seat next to the senators. So that definitely is referring to someone of the elite class. But still, if you're familiar with the HBO series, Titus Pullo, Varenus, contentious rivals in one of Caesar's legions during the Gallic War. I don't know what happened to them after the episode that Caesar relates, but it's an example of what this might look like. There was a skirmish in front of the camp that was under the command of Cicero. There had been a disaster that befell the legions of Cotta and Sabinus, and Cicero was attacked. These two centurions engaged the enemy voluntarily beyond the rampart, and both of them in the course of this engagement saved each other. Presumably they would have been awarded the civic crown. In any event, it is rare in Roman military history to get such details about the lower ranks. In this case, they're junior officers, equivalent to the modern captains, so they're not rank and file per se, but given the focus is on elites, it's interesting that we have the episode, the anecdote, and also the names, and it would be an example of something that would be commended with the civic crown. Lastly, on the subject of the civic crown, Plutarch, a Greek author from the imperial era, asks, what is the significance of the oak leaves? And he notes that the oak tree was a sacred tree to Jupiter, the chief god of the Roman pantheon. So was the eagle, which was also an important symbol to the Roman legions, the eagle standard. So the oak tree was not just significant to the Romans, it was also important to the Celts, and in Celtic mythology, the Romans and Celts were both Indo-European speaking peoples who go back far enough they could trace their roots to a common origin, roughly, and they both worship sky gods as the chief god or deity in their pantheon. So for the Celts, if you're familiar with Celtic lore and legend and mythology, the Druids were priests who were known as those who seek or understand the oak tree. And the Romans note that the Druids being the educated priestly class, they had a lot of functions, and they tended to frequent oak groves, and the oak tree was also sacred to them as well. Here is an illustration of Druids wearing crowns of oak leaves. For those that don't like the tangents and the comparative studies and just want me to focus on the Roman army, just bear with me, because I do find the Roman army interesting, but as an institution by itself, it's not that important. Its legacy is very important, but as an institution, it's been extinct for the past 1,500 years, so that's why these comparative studies and looking deeply at matters that pertain to common themes of the human condition. The Roman army is a good tool for this, for those that find the Roman army interesting. But by itself, I'm less interested in the Roman army, just stating it in and of itself by itself. But I do agree that it's a fascinating topic, but it's more fascinating when we look at where the Romans borrowed some of these ancient symbols, like the crown, for instance. We've been talking about this as one of the most prestigious awards in the Roman army. Dr. William V. Harris wrote a seminal work, War and Imperialism in Republican Rome. He made this point in another article: the soldier who is more frightened of his own officers than of the enemy may be effective, but is he necessarily courageous? We may even suspect that the army that needs very brutal discipline and practices such as decimation is precisely the army that cannot rely on the courage of its ordinary soldiers. Harris is a great scholar, but he is annoying, and he overstates his case here, like he did in his work above, in which he basically makes a sweeping castigation of Rome's entire foreign policy. Now, it was a good rebuttal to the earlier argument that Rome expanded merely through defensive imperialism. That is, they responded to provocations from enemies on their border. That's an oversimplification. So he's mostly correct, but he overstates his argument. In Roman imperialism, that's a topic for another time. Returning to courage and Rome's conceptualization of courage and discipline, I agree in part, but martial courage was one of the highest virtues espoused by the Romans, especially in the early Republic. And we have plenty of examples that attest to Romans attempting to live up to the ideal. Polybius, the Greek historian who saw the Roman army in action, lays out the dynamics pretty clearly. He admired the Roman system of punishing misbehavior and rewarding good behavior with incentives. So it's like the carrot and the stick, basically. And usually Polybius mentions this kind of information when it's something that the Greeks in his home country do not do. And so he really admired and explained these dynamics pretty clearly. Discipline, which the Romans are a symbol of tough discipline. It is coercive. It's there to prevent Roman soldiers from doing stuff they're not supposed to do, routing and abandoning their weapons, etc. But discipline alone doesn't really encourage soldiers to go beyond what their orders are. It just prevents them from disobeying orders. And so virtus is, I would say, probably the highest, the most important and valued quality virtue to the ancient Romans. Virtus meaning it meant more things besides courage and doesn't translate well into English. It encompassed the notion of manliness, the notion of virtue itself in time, not necessarily in early Rome. In those days, it just meant like martial courage, valor, manliness, and in time, virtue itself. And so the interplay of discipline and courage was something the Romans cultivated very well. Harris further quotes Pericles, the Athenian statesman whose funeral oration, this is a line from this speech, that greatly influenced President Abe Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which, if you're an American, you probably had to memorize a portion of that or the whole thing. Here's a line from the funeral oration of Pericles. "But the palm of courage will surely be adjudged most justly to those who best know the difference between hardship and pleasure, and yet are never tempted to shirk from danger." There is a difference, though, between voluntary courage, which we've been talking about, overcoming a fear, and so you must have fear of something in order to also have courage. If you're mad, irrational, or just reckless, you're not really overcoming the fear. Where is the courage? And so that's different from recklessness. The difference being, one, as Aristotle would define recklessness as a virtue in excess. Aristotle is my favorite Greek philosopher, and even if you have not heard of Aristotle, you've probably heard of the golden mean. So he states that virtue, in its purest form, lies between two extremes. On one side, you have vice, which is a scarcity of virtue. And on the other side of virtue, you have virtue in excess. So it's virtue that is no longer rational, reasonable, and potentially harmful. So a reasonable and rational man should strive towards virtue, which lies between two extreme modes of behavior. So in the present context, courage is a virtue, cowardice is a vice, and recklessness is virtue in excess. And you have to have fear to some extent. You have to have something to overcome in your mind to have courage. If you're not afraid of what you're doing at all, and something you're doing is demonstrably dangerous, you could be crazy or just, reckless. So an example of this, maybe you have other better examples, but you can get into the minds of the Greeks and the way they dealt with the concept of courage with Aristodemus. He was one of the two survivors of the Battle of Thermopylae. I think most people are familiar with the battle from the film 300. This fellow, Aristodemus, redeemed himself at the Battle of Plataea. He died there, but he was not judged the bravest. Posidonius, another Greek soldier who also fell that day, was judged to be the bravest because he acted within moderation, he fought courageously, and was not unusually motivated, like Aristodemus was, who wanted to redeem himself from his disgrace of Thermopylae. And yeah, I don't like the Spartans, but I respect the strictness and the clarity of their thinking. So here is Polybius describing various awards, which I mentioned earlier, and you can pause this to read it in more detail on your own, but the main point is the last line. Roman soldiers were commended when they had voluntarily and deliberately thrown themselves into danger. So the problem is this. So if a unit, let's say an entire legion, fights bravely, how do you distinguish those that went beyond the call of duty, so to speak? How do you distinguish them from those that were just not eager to run away from the battle because they knew they'd be punished? So collectively, a unit fights well, but Awards were given to those who had, demonstrably went beyond orders. Another key line from Polybius: by such incentives they excite to emulation and rivalry in the field not only the men who are present at these ceremonies where soldiers are awarded medals and decorations, not only the men who are present and listen to the words, but also those who remain home also. So this is a theme that sort of gels together the elements of discipline and courage. The ferocious rivalry and contention between Roman soldiers, between units, between legions, between different branches of service. This is an element that Polybius noticed, and other scholars, modern scholars, have talked about. There was a ferocious degree of rivalry and unit pride in the Roman army, and it's worth looking at because if you're defending your country, you have your motivation. But why did the Romans fight so consistently well in territories that had little to do with self-defense at all? So this rivalry, this hierarchy of competence, where soldiers would continuously be commended, be promoted based upon how well they conducted themselves in the eyes of their peers, was an important element in Roman military success for officers and rank and file alike. So to conclude on the golden mean of Aristotle, quoting, "Virtue, therefore, is a characteristic marked by choice, residing in the mean relative to us, a characteristic defined by reason." So virtue is a choice, and if you choose virtue, it's the rational choice. It does better for you. It's the better choice in the long term, almost always, which is an important topic for another time. Virtue does work better for you in the long term. It is the more practical solution. So it's not about just being nice. It's more practical. So virtue lies between two extremes, as I noted earlier: vice of scarcity, virtue of excess. Aristotle talks about the Celts briefly as not being afraid of anything. That's a virtue of excess. That can be a dangerous attitude to have. Admirable to a degree, but potentially pretty dangerous. So Caesar talks about the Celts in the commentaries. Aristotle doesn't get much into military tactics at all, but from other authors they're generalizing to a degree, and I don't mean to criticize Linden and then give Aristotle and Caesar a pass, but it seems in general the Celts were pretty ferocious in the initial charge, boundless energy and enthusiasm, but they staked the entire battle on that initial charge, and it was pretty fearsome, but if you defeated it, they kind of melted away. And not being afraid of a worthy opponent who could stand their ground resulted in some heavy defeats for the Celts at the hands of the Romans. John E. Linden, author of Soldiers and Ghosts, looks at this element of the Roman army, and I like how he's looking at the ethics of it. A lot of military historians, in general, are woefully inept and just dismissive of looking at the values themselves. Some of them, they get too comfortable just narrating the events, and that has its role, an accurate record of what happened. But it's also interesting to go deep and look at the virtues and the vices of the participants, of the soldiers who participate in these events. Some people say, all's fair in love and war. No, it isn't. There is a self-defense and aggression are ethically two completely different concepts. Aggression is unethical. Self-defense is the only form of valid, ethical use of violence. And so when you're looking at these values, you're looking at the Roman army, it is worth investigating how on earth they motivated these men to fight in wars that absolutely had nothing to do with their own self-defense or the defense of Rome. It's remarkable. The consistent record of success. So with that said, let's look at what Linden says here. He overstates his case, and just like Harris overstates his argument, but he's basically correct in that rivalry was a motivating factor for the Roman army. And if you look at the hoplite armies of, say, ancient Athens, for example, they had their motivation already. They normally served with people that they lived with and had known, like colleagues, family members, and so forth. That's the way they were recruited. The Roman legions were recruited differently. They were conscripts who may be serving alongside men they had never met before. Like I said, I basically agree with Lyndon's argument. He just overstates his case. He describes the Roman soldiers as being, in the early republic, as being so fierce that their social betters were just needed there to restrain them from going crazy. When you attach an individual characteristic to a group, that by definition is prejudice. It's a prejudicial comment that borders on elitism. I don't agree with, I don't believe that every Roman soldier behaved in that fashion, nor that they needed to be restrained by their social superiors, nor that such men were so different from those of the empire that they just represent a completely different class of men altogether. That's too much, but the argument is sound. The competitiveness. Also, I don't see courage and discipline as operating against each other. Adrian Goldsworthy, famous Roman military historian, notes this as well. They're complementary. They're a part of the same system. So for fans of Dr. Jordan Peterson, I'm more interested in his academic work than when he talks about politics. But I did learn about the 5-factor model and personality from Dr. Peterson, and it's a better model for reconstructing profiles. But we have no evidence, basically, we don't have a lot of evidence to reconstruct some kind of hypothetical profile for an ancient Roman rank-and-file legionary. Nevertheless, it provides some boundaries and a means of sort of analyzing Roman ethics. Very briefly, the 5-factor model is a better model for a psychological profile and provides boundaries, etc. Openness, basically creativity, conscientiousness. This is an important element for the present topic. Roman values, Roman civilization, they seem to have an ingrained, or they cultivated the highest ideal of conscientiousness. They were very orderly, which branches off from conscientiousness, which is basically reliability, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Here are some examples from Roman military history. Rivalry between Roman armies, between branches of service, units, and individual soldiers. Now, going back deep into the annals of Roman military history, we have the Siege of Cominium in 293 BC during the Third Samnite War and the conquest of Italy. There were 2 consuls in the field. One, by the name of Volumnius, captured the enemy's camp. The other, Scipio, not the later Scipio Africanus who beat Hannibal, but an earlier one, appealed to his soldiers to not be shamed by the other Roman army and to not allow them to reap all the glory from the campaign. So he inspired them, grabbed a shield, and led another assault on the city itself, and his soldiers followed behind him. The next example is the Siege of Cartagena, in which the Roman commander was Scipio. This is Scipio Africanus, the most famous Scipio, the one who beat Hannibal. He had to resolve a dispute here between the army and the quote-unquote Marines. Roman Marines were usually just legionaries that were temporarily assigned to the fleet, but in any event, the army and the Marines both put forward claimants to the mural crown, which was, as we discussed earlier, this is awarded to the first soldier over the enemy's wall. He assigned judges. They couldn't decide the matter, and Scipio himself, I guess to avoid a brawl within his own army, said that both claimants would be given the award. So the next example is a minor episode in the conquest of Greece, Battle of Cynocephalae. The Romans invaded Macedon right after the Second Punic War. Despite the enormous casualties, they were really chagrined with King Philip for siding with Hannibal. After this battle, there was a dispute between the legionaries and their own allies over the spoils. The last example we've already discussed, Pulo and Varenus, the 2 centurions who carried on a personal grudge, a fierce rivalry within their legion, so fierce that they saved each other's lives to prevent their rival from gaining all the glory. So the Roman army, especially the legions, had a extraordinary level of esprit de corps. And I came across another interesting example from Tacitus, Roman historian from the imperial era. There was an attempt by the government to settle some veterans in some colonies, and they mixed together some units instead of settling the unit with their officers, settling whole units with their officers as they had previously done. What happened was the men started to just pack up and go home. They didn't form a united community, and it's kind of interesting. It's like veterans from the Marines or the Royal Marines, veterans of an elite unit that has a lot of pride, as just like refusing to live anywhere in any other neighborhood except in a community of their own. That's an extraordinary degree of unit pride and esprit de corps. So what was the job of the Roman commander? He had numerous functions, but one of them was to observe the conduct of his soldiers, to award decorations fairly and justly and accurately. And it's almost paradoxical, but the Roman general was closer to his soldiers physically on the battlefield than modern generals are in a democracy, representative government like Britain or the United States. But the Roman general, despite the physical proximity on the battlefield, in some cases fighting alongside them in the front lines, they were quite distant socially. Less so in modern society. Anyways, authors, in particular Julius Caesar, emphasizes the importance of Roman commanders observing carefully the conduct of their soldiers to award decorations fairly. So at first this may seem like an odd digression for a presentation on the Roman army, but the Roman army was an institution in which human beings were judged and evaluated and promoted, for the most part based upon their ability, with exceptions. And if you're a fan of Dr. Peterson, you've come across these models before, but they are useful for looking at reward systems and looking at the phenomenon of why some individuals seem to be especially productive. Yes, willpower is a factor amongst like about 50 others that aren't really by choice at all. So it is complicated and it's worth looking at. If you've listened to Dr. Peterson's lectures at the University of Toronto on YouTube, you've probably come across the terms Pareto Distribution and Price's Law. Peterson was looking at the phenomenon of how rewards, whether it's land, money, titles, fame, tends to be accumulated by a select few. With the Pareto distribution, we have the Italian economist, sociologist Pareto, who is famous but criticized for his law of income distribution, a complicated formula in which he was attempting to prove that the distribution of incomes and wealth in society is not random, but it's a consistent pattern throughout history and in all parts of the world. With Price's law, it's a square root formula. A tiny percentage of people produce most of the outcome. The square root of the people produce half of the product. And this is regardless of what particular activity or livelihood, trade that we're talking about, or reward that we're talking about. And when you look at models in other fields and disciplines like this, it does make the Roman army make more sense. Given that it's an ancient, extinct institution, looking at other models and doing comparative studies makes the Roman army and what they do make more sense, particularly the element of meritocracy, awarding military decorations, promotions, promoting men from the rank and file legionaries to the extremely vital and critical position of centurions. Centurions were vital to the efficient operation of the Roman army in battle. Peterson describes this as a vicious statistic, but we know that resources are limited, and more so when an organization gets bigger. So with, again, the Roman army, ancient institution, we don't have as much evidence for it as we do other institutions that are modern and still exist, but still using other models from fields makes it more understandable. Some of the things the Romans did and the concept of meritocracy in the Roman army, it makes sense. Resources are limited, and even more so when an organization becomes bigger. And through no sin, through no virtue of your own, people are born into environments and with certain genetic predispositions. So you have most soldiers, as Adrian Goldsworthy talked about in his book, Roman Warfare, most soldiers, like, their primary aim is to survive the battle and not die. But a few want to advance themselves through any number of factors contribute to this, like upbringing, training, experience. They're bigger. They have a greater chance of surviving single combat with the enemy. They have just through no virtue of their own, they're born with a genetic predisposition to more bravely run the risks of danger and therefore fight their way into the enemy's formation to enable a breakthrough. As Goldsworthy talks about how a rout begins in the battle involves courageous soldiers who are going in first. And so there's a select few who then are going to be rewarded for these acts. Organizations thrive when they promote competence, and Price's law is a vicious statistic, but for other reasons that Peterson doesn't get into. If we have any free will, it's pretty limited. For example, you would not be permitted to serve in a Roman legion. In some cases, you wouldn't even be permitted to live. If you're born physically disabled, you might be exposed on a hill and left there to die. Even if you're able-bodied, you might be picked up by a slaver and be spared the worst fate, but you might be left there. And so if you're born physically disabled, this is through no sin of your own. If you're not born physically disabled, that is through no virtue of your own. And it is unfair, but the universe is amoral and doesn't care. Now, that's a dramatic example, but people are also born into environments and with genes that they didn't pick out. I mean, you didn't choose to be subject to mental illness in your adulthood, which would prohibit and possibly prevent you entirely from rising up the chain of command in the Roman army. So there's a lot of these limitations that I'm not sure if just through sheer willpower would make any difference at all. It certainly would help, but it's not going to make all the difference. But it does help. So let's look at some of these examples of people who would prove Price's law in the context of the Roman army. Extremely productive individuals. So first off, there's Sicinius Dentatus, from, again, going way back in the annals of Roman military history to the early Republic. He is described by Aulus Gellius and Pliny the Elder as a warrior, an aristocratic warrior of incredible energy. He fought in 120 battles with not one scar on his back, but 44 scars in the front, so he never turned his back to an armed opponent. Won 8 golden crowns, the mural crown once, the siege crown once, the mural crown 3 times, civic crown 14 times, 83 neck chains, and 160 armlets, and 18 spears. And besides this, he was presented with 25 other decorations and spoils of war, many of which were won in single combat. And he took part with his commanders in 9 triumphal processions. So this soldier lived at around 4 50 BC. If these details are true, this guy is like a one-man army. I mean, if you were conducting a levy and you see Dentatus show up, it's like you can recruit him alone and tell the other fellows to go back home. We don't need you. Spurius Ligustinus, though, is, I would say, probably more trustworthy. The details: he's a centurion who served in the early to middle 2nd century BC, a centurion who fought both in Spain and the Third Macedonian War, and the time period is closer to a better documented and a better historically documented period. And so he's given a speech, and it's an unusual speech. Rarely do Roman authors who were aristocrats, mostly writing for aristocrats, put so many words in the mouth of a person who's not an aristocrat. He was a rank-and-file legionary who was promoted for his virtus, his courage, to centurion, and in his speech, which is unusual, probably a real person. I have no reason to doubt that the speech may not be authentic, but the specific details of his career make me think not only the man himself really existed, but also the military awards that he lists are also accurate. So he says that he was promoted successively by various commanders for his virtus. He won 6 civic crowns and was commended a total 34 times. He was rewarded for his virtus. And the reason, the context of his speech was a group of centurions were objecting to the loss of their status when the Romans were attempting to enroll a new army to confront the Macedonians again. This was the Third Macedonian War. In any event, it's an interesting speech because it supports a number of my premises. First, that virtue itself, including virtus, martial courage, but not limited to this, was open to every Roman regardless of whether they're an aristocrat or they're a member of the lower classes. And he himself is a Sabine, of Sabine descent, as he mentions in his speech, so he's not a true-born Latin, but it's hard to say who was true-born at all in Rome. By the time of the 2nd century BC, there was so much intermixing. Slave, once manumitted, was given citizenship, and the Sabines were part of Roman tradition from a very early period when a large contingent migrated to Rome and were given citizenship. And the early history of Rome is, I'm not an expert on, but it seems like the community was cosmopolitan from the very beginning. So Rome, your Romanness was defined by your citizenship and your values, and you display competence, you get rewarded regardless of your background. So this also gets into what Jordan Peterson was talking about, how structures in a society can't just be explained away by social construction as the postmodernists do. Hierarchies exist because they're effective when they promote competence, particularly when they grow in size. Julius Caesar himself, in his early career as a junior officer, won the civic crown. He participated in the siege of Mytilene, taken by storm, and he was presented a civic crown by his commander when he was on his staff in Bithynia. So I'll wrap up in conclusion. It's been a long presentation. Thanks for listening. The Roman military awards, antecedents in athletic contests, particularly the crown which was awarded to victors. A lot of the symbols of Roman military awards also have religious connotations, an aspiration to divinity, if you will. mortals can't be gods, but they can aspire to be like the gods. And so the crown made of oak leaves, the civic crown at least, sacred to Jupiter. And as I noted, discipline, courage, complementary. The Romans had a sophisticated conceptualization of discipline and of courage that complemented each other, and underlying both was a ferociously intense competitive ethos, a rivalry between units, between armies, between soldiers that spurred them on to rise up in this hierarchy of competence. Was it a perfect hierarchy? Not by any stretch of the imagination. Aristocratic commanders were trained to be brave and to lead, but nepotism, classism led to some serious disasters. But there was the ideal of competence. So the next presentation, I might not even be talking about the Roman army, but I will return to the Roman army frequently. But I would like to get into other fields like philosophy, particularly Aristotle, and the golden mean. That is a very important concept. So again, thanks for listening. Lastly, the research is time-consuming and extensive, so if you would at least consider offering a tip or donation, don't have to, but if you liked what you heard and would like to hear more of it, please consider a tip on the website listed again after the bibliography. Thanks, and thanks for listening.